When it comes to incredible stories, one cannot fail to mention this one. Perhaps such incidents are worth knowing about them all over the world. This incident occurred in Italy in 1939. Leonarda Cianciulli, a soap merchant from Correggio, offered her fragrant goods to city residents and at the same time treated them to homemade cookies. But the ingredients of these products were somewhat peculiar, but this became known much later. Leonarda Cianciulli was born on November 14, 1893, in Montella, a city in the Italian province of Avellino. From an early age, the girl suffered from a lack of maternal love. Her mother Amelia really did not love her, since her daughter was the product of violence and therefore most often she treated her poorly and even beat her. The fact is that every time the mother looked at her daughter, she reminded her of the reason for her marriage to a man whom she did not love. Already at a very young age, Leonarda twice tried to commit suicide in order to stop enduring the bullying and beatings that had become unbearable for her. In 1914, having met a young man named Raphael Pansardi, a postal worker, the girl decided to marry him. More than anything, she wanted to leave her parents' home, so she didn't hesitate for a second in her decision. However, the parents were against this marriage, as they planned to marry their daughter to her cousin. After Leonarda's wedding, her mother was so angry with her that she cursed her for the rest of her days. Leonarda pretended that she didn't care and settled with her husband in the small town of Laura. It would seem that everything is fine in the couple's life, but just a few years after the wedding, Raphael began to drink constantly. A desperate need for money led Leonarda to prison, where she was placed for fraud, but even after years the family's situation did not improve. In 1930, a powerful earthquake of magnitude 7 occurred in the Italian region, which resulted in significant loss of life and massive destruction of buildings. Leonarda's house was also damaged by the earthquake and, left homeless, the family moved back to Correggio. Leonarda had a strange obsession with motherhood. Perhaps childhood trauma was the reason she had to go through 17 pregnancies. Although 13 children did not survive, 10 of them died in the first months of life, and she could not bear the remaining 3. As a result, only 4 children remained alive, whom Leonarda overprotected because she wanted to protect them from her mother's curse. One fortune teller, whom she turned to find out the future, said that she saw a prison in her right hand and a psychiatric hospital in her left. Leonarda mentioned that every night she dreamed of small white coffins, one after another being swallowed up by the earth. Unable to bear the loss of another child, she began reading books on palmistry, astronomy, spells, curses, and spiritualism. Meanwhile, Leonarda's husband's problems with alcohol became even more noticeable. There was absolutely nothing to feed the family. The couple constantly quarreled and eventually decided to divorce. Having broken off relations with her husband, Leonarda moved to the 3rd floor of a building on Vicavore Avenue with her 4 children, where, despite the bad omens that her mother spoke of, she managed to change the course of her life and opened a small store. It seemed that luck was on Leonard's side as never before. She successfully sold old clothes, soap, and even told fortunes with cards, since from an early age she was interested in studying the occult and black magic. Leonarda's friendly and helpful nature earned her great respect throughout the area. Her family seemed completely normal, with 4 children who behaved well at school and had many friends. Despite her divorce from her husband, Leonarda never forbade him to see his children. In addition, she loved to invite her neighbors for tea and dessert. Everything changed dramatically when one of Leonarda's sons, Giuseppe, her favorite, decided to go fight in the Italian army during the Second World War. From that moment on, the woman could not find a place for herself from excitement. The departure of her son gave her a feeling of endless melancholy and fear. Her superstitious nature forced her to convince herself that the time had come to help herself by turning to the occult arts. So Leonarda developed a sinister, creepy plan that included human sacrifices in order to protect the young man from any evil. To bring her ideas to life, Leonarda used tarot cards. It was the perfect way to get the attention of his victims. At some point, Leonarda realized that she would not have to look for and invite future victims to her home, because her 3 friends constantly came to her. Being single and not young women, they looked to the sympathetic Leonarda for consolation and advice. Among the 3 friends was Francesca Clementina Sovi, an unmarried woman who nursed children in her neighborhood. Virginia Cacioppo, a former opera singer who managed to travel to different parts of the world and achieved a certain reputation. And Ermelinda Faustina Seti, a semi-literate hillbilly with a submissive but quarrelsome character. All 3 met every now and then at Leonarda's house, where they chatted all evening long. The fear of losing his son forced Leonard to act immediately. She made a decision and promised herself to make it happen before it was too late and she would never be able to see her beloved son. The first victim, Ermelinda Faustina, died at the hands of Leonarda on December 17, 1939. In her last conversations with her friend, Leonarda predicted her imminent marriage. And then one day Ermelinda came to visit Leonarda again, and since then no one has seen her again. On the eve of that day, Ermelinda Faustina Seti asked her neighbor if she could take care of her cat for a few days, since she had to leave. The cards laid out by Leonarda promised the woman a meeting with the love of her life. That day, December 17th, she took a long time to preen herself. Ermelinda put on a complex hairstyle on her head, did makeup and sprayed perfume all over her body. The woman looked excited. She could not restrain herself and admitted to some acquaintances that she was getting married and moving to a city in southern Italy. The last time the residents of Correggio saw her was when she entered Leonarda's house. Once there, she disappeared. However, her disappearance did not raise suspicions, as many thought that she had probably left to meet the love of her life and had stopped by to say goodbye to her best friend. When in reality everything was completely different. Leonarda made her friend believe that she would meet her future husband in the town of Pula by saying that this man was her own friend who allegedly dreamed of meeting Ermelinda. Seizing the moment, Leonarda invited her friend to take care of her property during her departure and forced her to sign a notarized letter stating that she, Leonarda, would remain in charge of her savings. Leonarda asked Ermelinda not to tell anyone anything in order to avoid gossip and misfortune, but she advised her to write letters to her friends so that as soon as she left, her friend could convey news from her to them. Leonarda also added that she would be glad if, on the eve of her departure, Ermelinda came to her to say goodbye. When Leonarda met her friend at the door, she looked happy and smart. The hostess offered the guest a glass of wine, into which she mixed sleeping pills. As soon as Ermelinda fell asleep, Leonarda dragged her into a small room, took an axe and chopped her body into 9 pieces. After that, she took 2 pre-prepared basins, put the body fragments into them, and then filled a cauldron with water, which she bought specifically for soap making, and put it on the fire with water to boil. Then she added 7 kilograms of caustic soda and body parts to the cauldron. Leonarda stirred the mixture until the fragments of the victim's body dissolved and turned black. She then poured the resulting mixture into buckets to let it steep. Having looked at the resulting mixture, Leonard thought a little and said, "Now we have enough soap for 6 months." As for the victim's blood, Leonarda waited until it coagulated and placed it in the oven to dry. Then the criminal mixed this ingredient with flour, added sugar, chocolate, milk and eggs, mixed everything thoroughly, baked crispy cookies, which she distributed to her next guests, and also ate herself and treated the children. Ermelinda's disappearance went unnoticed. The neighbors remembered that she was going to go live in Pola, and since she was not married, no one looked for her and did not suspect anything was wrong. Everything went as usual, but 9 months later, on September 5, 1940, Leonarda decided to repeat her plan and make another sacrifice. Francesca Clementina Sovi became her. Shortly before the next murder, Leonarda guessed to her friend that she would soon leave Correggio to take the place of director of a boarding school in Piacenza, because one of her friends, the school director, was ready to take her as his replacement. Just like the first time, Leonarda advised her second victim not to share the good news with anyone, so as not to scare away her luck. Instead, she recommended that Francesca send postcards to her family saying that she would have to leave because she had received a place in Piacenza. This time, Leonarda also offered her friend her candidacy as the manager of her property and responsible for their sale if necessary. Then everything went according to the same plan. Francesca dropped in to say goodbye to Leonarda, drank wine with sleeping pills, and then the criminal killed her, dismembered her and included her in the soap and recipe for the already beloved cookies. The disappearance of Francesca Clementina did not arouse any suspicion, since all her friends knew that she had found a good job and did not have time to say goodbye, except that she entrusted her savings to Leonarda. 2 months later, on November 30, 1940, when Leonarda decided that her sacrifices were really working, she decided to carry out her plan for the third time. She chose 59-year-old soprano Virginia Cacioppo as her victim. According to the maps, Virginia's fortunes were about to change. Leonarda informed her that the theater manager in Florence needed a secretary with knowledge in the field of singing, and supposedly he was ready to give this position to Virginia. Next, Leonarda asked her friend not to tell anyone anything, as was the case in 2 previous cases. But the future victim immediately began sharing the great news with her closest people. At noon on November 30th, Leonarda opened the door of her house for Virginia. She would have known that at that moment Virginia's daughter-in-law watched her enter the house, but never came out again. Everything was done the same as the previous 2 times, except that now Leonarda acted with much greater knowledge of the matter. Now she not only threw the body into the boiling cauldron, but also added a bottle of cologne to it. The smell that the brew emitted was magnificent. After a few hours, Leonard managed to make an excellent soap with a creamy texture. Then she returned to preparing her desserts, so popular and delicious that people who tried them said that they were a real masterpiece, and Leonarda claimed that we were talking about her signature recipe. A few days later, Leonarda began distributing bars of soap to her neighbors and also treating them to her famous cookies. The woman was proud of the recognition of the town residents, who saw her as a kind woman always ready to help. Meanwhile, Virginia's daughter-in-law Albertina Fanti became concerned about her mother-in-law's sudden disappearance. There was not even an address where she could be found, and this seemed strange to Albertina, because usually her relative behaved completely differently. Then she decided to officially report the woman's disappearance to the police chief of Correggio. During interrogation, Albertina Fanti mentioned that the last time she saw Virginia, she went to see Leonard Cianciulli. During the investigations, it turned out that 2 other friends of Leonarda had disappeared without a trace. Further searches revealed the nuances of this criminal incident, which was not only surprising, but also caused collective horror throughout the area. Literally all the residents managed to eat Leonarda's cookies and bathe with soap that contained the bodies of Leonarda's victims. During a search of Leonarda's home, police found jewelry and other belongings of the 3 victims hidden under the brickwork. In addition, they were able to find the dentures of the 3 women. In the room they found 3 axes, several knives and a cauldron in which the criminal had immersed the bodies to make soap from them. All these tools and utensils are currently in the Criminological Museum in Rome. Seeing that she had been brought into the open, Leonarda confessed to her crimes, revealing her course of action, which began with convincing the victims that a bright future awaited them in the form of a desired job or love. Once the victims fell into the trap, they were ready to leave all their property to Leonarda. Then she treated them to a glass of wine with sleeping pills. When the women fell asleep to Leonard, she took an axe and killed them, then proceeded to cut up the bodies in a basin, so that she could then make soap from them. She baked her desserts from the blood of the victims. After the search, investigators contacted the 2 men to whom Clementine and Virginia intended to go, as at some point they thought that they were talking about a criminal group. But after further investigation, those men were excluded from the case. They of course did not suspect anything. Leonarda's son was also arrested for alleged complicity in the crime, since the police did not believe that the woman acted alone. Having served 5 years in prison before trial, her son Giuseppe was released due to lack of evidence. Leonarda tried to convince the jury that her son had nothing to do with the crime and that all responsibility lay with her. She was taken to the morgue in order to exclude her son from the case and prove that only she was involved in the crime. Incredibly, it only took Leonarda 12 minutes to autopsy her body. The trial began on June 12, 1946. During the trial, Leonarda tried to justify her actions by saying that she was paying a blood tribute in connection with the memory of her departed mother. Her mother appeared in her dreams and threatened to take the lives of her children unless she sacrificed the innocent lives of others in return. At one point, the medical examiner said that Leonarda would not have been able to turn the bodies of her victims into soap, but then the woman stood up and said, "If anyone present in this court brings me a body of any age, I can easily prove everything." A few days after the trial began, Leonarda was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a women's psychiatric prison near Cianciulli, where she died of a stroke on October 15, 1970. At the age of 77 years. During her life and after her death, many books were published about her case, among which the most famous was The Confession of a Bitter Soul. Leonarda received the nickname of the soapmaker from Correggio. Before us as an impressive case, no one could have imagined that a woman whom everyone knew as a good person would be able to commit such acts and even involve the entire neighborhood in them. Forcing people to eat cookies and wash themselves with soap containing the bodies of her victims.